Welcome to She is Resilient, a podcast for women on their healing journeys who are ready to start living their most authentic and empowered lives outside of survival mode. I'm your host, Tatiana, trauma and somatic therapist, as well as a holistic coach, and I'm on a mission to help more women heal their nervous systems. Each week, me and my guests are going to get real and vulnerable about the experiences that led us to becoming the empowered and resilient women we are today. You'll leave this podcast with the skills, knowledge, and inspiration to start creating the life you deserve. Because if another woman can do it, so can you. Hello! Oh my goodness, I cannot believe it's finally here. Welcome to the very first episode of She is Resilient. Today we're going to talk all about my journey from living in a state of survival mode to feeling empowered and living my most authentic life that has ultimately led to creating this podcast, something that I had never imagined myself doing. So fun fact before we start, a former supervisor of mine had briefly suggested that podcasting could be in my future earlier in 2023, and I was like, I don't really think that's my thing, and yet here we are. So let's dive in. So actually, before we start, first just want to say that this is a podcast all about getting real and vulnerable about the struggles that we've experienced that led us to becoming the empowered women we are today. And so I'm finally at a place in my life where I feel like I have the capacity to share my story a little bit more. So some of the things that I'm going to share on here, I'm probably saying it out loud for the first time outside of my therapist and my husband. So it's kind of a big deal. So as most of you know, if you follow me on Instagram, I've been pretty vocal about being a complex trauma survivor and living in survival mode for most of my life. But what does that mean? Being a complex trauma survivor basically means that someone has experienced multiple traumatic experiences, not just one. And most of these traumatic experiences start in early childhood. So as a child, I was very anxious to the point where I would literally become mute whenever someone spoke to me or whenever I didn't feel safe around somebody. And because of my chronic anxiety, I experienced pretty severe stomach pains that led to ongoing doctor visits and blood work with zero results. So nobody really knew what was going on with me, and I certainly didn't know what was going on with me. And so I went through my childhood with undiagnosed anxiety. And I think that because of my anxiety, along with some of my other trauma responses, I really struggled to develop healthy friendships and romantic relationships, which is something that I'll get into in future episodes. But basically, I struggled significantly throughout my childhood and teenage years with both anxiety and depression, to the point where I experienced ongoing suicidal thoughts, and nobody really knew about it. And that's one of the major reasons why I decided to become a therapist. I really wanted to help children and adolescents not feel the way that I did as a child. And as I say that, I also just want to add that from the outside looking in, my childhood wasn't bad. From the outside looking in, I had, quote unquote, a normal childhood. But there's lots of generational trauma that really impacted my nervous system that weren't very obvious to the people on the outside. So, fast forward to my college years, I was finally starting to feel more confident, and I would say that between the ages of 17 to 19, I was feeling probably like my best self at the time. My anxiety was really low, almost non existent, and I was meeting new people. I was partying a lot, I was drinking a lot, and like most college students do. My social life was pretty great, but academically, I was failing a lot of my classes, and I'm pretty sure I failed Psychology 101 3 times. Um, and honestly, I'm not ashamed to share that because I think that a lot of the time we see people online who are successful and might think that things came easily to them, and that's just not true. Every single person who is successful has struggled in some way. And if you really want to do something, then do it, no matter how long it takes. So I failed psychology numerous times, but I knew at my core that I wanted to be a therapist, that I wanted to help people. So I just kept going. I just kept taking the classes. And I kind of always struggled in school. Going back to early elementary school, I truly believe that my dysregulated nervous system is what contributed to a lot of my difficulty in learning. So even though I wasn't doing so great academically, I felt pretty good inside for the most part at that time in my life. This was until I experienced a rupture in a pretty important relationship, a friendship at the time that really triggered my relational trauma. So I would say around that time, around my junior year of college until 2020, when I started my somatic experiencing training, my anxiety significantly worsened. I started grad school in 2014, and honestly, grad school was the worst for me. And I think that if I had a regulated nervous system, I don't think it would have been that bad, right? Like, there's always some level of stress that comes with being in school, but I don't think that if I wasn't so dysregulated, I don't think I would have hated it so much as I did. And so because I hated grad school, because I wasn't feeling great there and where I was, I started to drink heavily on the weekends to relieve that stress that I was experiencing, that anxiety that I was experiencing. And I made some pretty poor choices, which then led to cycles of shame. And I mean, if you've ever experienced deep shame, you know what that's like. You know that it's not fun. So as I'm reflecting on this, as I'm thinking about that period of my life, I'm also just thinking about how I put on a brave face all of the time. I was really good at just smiling through things and laughing things off, and humor and fun really became one of my defense mechanisms. So it was really hard to tell that there was anything ever going on with me, which obviously has its pros and cons. And one of the cons was, I think that I, from my perspective, was probably viewed as the strong friend, the one that maybe didn't need to be checked on because, that they had it all figured out. So anyway, once I graduated, I started my very first job as an outpatient counselor at a nonprofit organization, and I loved it. I absolutely loved learning and growing as a therapist, but again, I was living in a chronic state of survival. So I was constantly in a state of fight or flight, and I struggled with making connections at work. I struggled significantly with anxiety when it came to presentations or meetings or consultations, or honestly, just interacting with my coworkers. And to reduce that anxiety, I kept to myself. I would avoid people. I would call out sick if I was too anxious to do something. And I was constantly asking for more work. So because I was living in a state of fight or flight, I was always needing more work to keep me stimulated. And as a result, I would burn out and I would fall into a state of freeze, which will always happen if you stay too long in a state of fight or flight. That's just how the nervous system works. If we're in a sympathetic state of activation for too long, we will always fall into a state of freeze, which is where burnout lives, which is where depression lives, which is where dissociation lives. So in 2020, during that time when everyone really had no choice but to slow down, I started to feel unfulfilled. And I shared that with my supervisor at the time, the same supervisor who predicted podcasting would be in my future. Shout out to Sophie if you're listening. And she had suggested that I do a training. So I agreed, and I started to look for a training that I'd be interested in. And I came across somatic experiencing. And when I started to read about somatic experiencing, I felt like it was the training that resonated with me the most because I had already been doing a bit of mind-body practices with my clients, except I didn't really have the language or the knowledge to back it up. And so I just went with it. But to be honest, I had no idea that somatic experiencing was going to quite literally change my life. When I started somatic experiencing, everything started to shift. I started connecting with my body in a way that I had never done before. I started to understand the way that my nervous system worked and why I was continuing to experience severe anxiety. And I started to shift out of survival very slowly. So part of the somatic experiencing training requires you to get X amount of hours of your own personal sessions. And for those of you who aren't familiar with somatic experiencing is a body-oriented approach to healing trauma and rewiring the nervous system. And it's absolutely mind-boggling how much my nervous system has shifted since doing my personal sessions. So with somatic experiencing, I was able to grow the capacity to be with all of my emotions. I was able to come back home to the confident person that I know I am at my core. My social anxiety significantly decreased. And I've been able to unapologetically take up more space. I started to really look at my life through a different lens, and I started to value myself more. And so with that, I started to limit the access that people had to me. So engaging in relationships that were reciprocal and supportive to my nervous system, as opposed to dysregulating it. I was able to move out of a free state and take more intentional action on my eating habits. So eating foods that made me feel good, limiting the amount of alcohol and caffeine that I was consuming, and so basically all of the things that were contributing to my dysregulation. And I honestly believe that this only happened because I started my somatic experiencing journey. And I know this because I had already been in and out of talk therapy for about 4 years at this time before I started my somatic healing journey. So I believe so much in the power of somatic experiencing and healing the root of your problems through nervous system regulation. And I want every single woman, and I mean, truly everyone, but I only work with women, and that can be a conversation for another episode, but I want every woman to know that there is a life outside of survival mode, and it starts with your nervous system. Healing your nervous system is truly the secret to living your most intentional and fulfilling life. But I also want you to know that when I talk about healing your nervous system, I'm talking about living a life outside of survival mode, because I do understand that healing is lifelong, but living in survival mode does not have to be lifelong. So I hope that you can see yourself in some parts of my story, and my hope is that I can spread more awareness around healing the nervous system, because I truly want to contribute to raising children who don't have to heal from their childhoods, because I want you to be unstoppable in this lifetime, because we need more women who are supporting each other instead of competing against one another. And because the more healed nervous systems they are, the kinder the world will be. So thank you so much for being here, and I cannot wait to continue to share my journey with you. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you absolutely loved this episode, I would so appreciate it if you subscribed and left a review on Apple Podcast, or take a screenshot and share this episode on social media. Don't forget to tag me at tatiana.holistic.coach. The more nervous systems we reach, the more generational cycles we break, and the more we contribute to a kinder and safer world. And if you're looking for somatic healing services, send me a DM and I'd love to chat on how I can support you. I'll see you in the next episode.